Ed Gein and Augusta Gein were bound by fear, control, and obsession, a mother and son trapped in a small Wisconsin farm where darkness grew in the shadows, shaping a boy into a man whose name would later send shivers across the nation. Ed Gein's childhood was a landscape shaped by fear, isolation, and a suffocating sense of control that clung to him like a second skin. Born in a small, rural town in Wisconsin, his earliest memories were steeped in the shadow of his mother, a woman whose religious fervor bordered on obsession. She preached that the world outside their farm was corrupt, filled with sin, temptation, and danger. Her voice was constant in his mind, echoing warnings about men, women, and the wickedness of society. She demanded absolute obedience, and Ed learned quickly that defiance would not only bring punishment, but moral ruin. His father was a figure of absence as much as presence, a man lost to drinking and the harsh routines of farm life. The distance between them left Ed to navigate a world dominated by his mother's uncompromising rules, her dark view of humanity imprinting itself onto the contours of his young mind. The farm was both his prison and his playground, a confined world of barns, woods, and fields where life and death intertwined in ways that fascinated and terrified him. While other children ran and laughed together, Ed wandered alone, drawn to the hidden corners of the property where he could observe animals, insects, and the slow decay of life with intense curiosity. He collected bones, feathers, and other remnants, feeling a strange sense of control over the natural order of things. The death of a farm animal was not merely an end. It was a transformation, a shift in form that held a mysterious, almost sacred significance. As he grew older, these obsessions became more intricate, more detailed, feeding a quiet compulsion to understand and manipulate life and death. School offered no refuge. Ed's peers were distant and alien, their laughter and careless cruelty highlighting the vast chasm between himself and the ordinary world. He learned to retreat inward, constructing a mental landscape in which he could explore his obsessions safely, away from prying eyes and judgment. The whispers of townspeople followed him, small suspicions about a boy who did not play, who did not speak freely, who seemed to watch the world rather than participate in it. These observations only reinforced his sense of difference, deepening the isolation that would become a defining feature of his psyche. By adolescence, the fusion of fear, repression, and fascination with death had created a fragile but dangerous foundation. His mother's teachings became a lens through which he interpreted every action, every desire, and every curiosity. Normal human impulses, like curiosity about the opposite sex or the desire for companionship, were met with guilt and fear, driving him further into the shadows of his own mind. The natural progression of childhood exploration twisted into obsession, and Ed began experimenting with the small animals he found in the woods and around the farm, studying their anatomy, their decay, and the inevitability of mortality. In these quiet, lonely hours, Ed was learning lessons that would shape the man he would become. The allure of control over life and death, the thrill of secrets, and the comfort of isolation. Each act, small and seemingly insignificant to outsiders, built upon the last, layering fear, obsession, and fascination into a complex web. By the time he left childhood behind, Ed Gein had already begun the slow, inexorable descent into a world ruled by shadows, a world in which his mother's voice and the whisper of the woods would guide him toward unimaginable darkness. Adolescence for Ed Gein was a time of tightening control and deepening obsession, dominated by the presence of his mother and the rigid moral world she imposed. She forbade him from seeking friendship, companionship, or romance, insisting that men were corrupt and women were dangerous, that desire itself was sinful. Every thought that crept into Ed's mind that contradicted her strict teachings was met with guilt and shame, a suffocating weight that forced him further into isolation. While other boys his age ventured into the wider world, Exploring social bonds and discovering their own identities, Ed remained confined to the farm, under the constant scrutiny of his mother's unyielding gaze. The boundaries she set were absolute, shaping not only his daily life but the very way he perceived morality, love, and human connection. The farm became his entire universe, a place where the ordinary rhythms of life were overshadowed by an ever-present sense of dread and curiosity. Ed learned to observe carefully, to notice the small details others ignored. He watched animals with fascination, studying the patterns of life and death, the way flesh decayed and bones endured. He began experimenting on the creatures he found, dissecting them, preserving parts, and cataloging what he discovered. These early rituals were private, secret acts that allowed him a sense of mastery over life and death. With each experiment, he felt a quiet thrill, a power that contrasted sharply with the fear and submission his mother demanded in every other aspect of his life. The isolation imposed on him by his mother had another effect. It amplified his awareness of the human body and its fragility. Forbidden from forming relationships, Ed became fixated on understanding what lay beneath the surface of life, both physically and metaphorically. He read obsessively when books were available and explored the land around the farm with a careful eye for the hidden, the unusual, and the forgotten. Small signs of decay, abandoned objects, and traces of animals left a lasting impression on him, feeding his curiosity and laying the groundwork for the compulsions that would later define him. Neighbors began to notice peculiarities in the Gein household. Pets disappeared without explanation. Strange smells drifted from the barns, and Ed himself became increasingly withdrawn. Yet even these subtle signs were not enough to raise alarm. He presented a quiet, unassuming exterior, a facade that masked the growing darkness within. Inside, however, the seeds of obsession were taking root with relentless precision. He began to develop rituals of observation and collection, secret behaviors that provided him comfort and a sense of control in a world that felt inherently threatening and confusing. By the time he reached late adolescence, Ed's mind had become a landscape dominated by fear, fascination, and compulsive curiosity. The strict doctrines of his mother intertwined with his obsession with death, shaping his understanding of morality and desire. Ordinary impulses were transformed into guilt and obsession, while forbidden curiosity became an irresistible force. The foundations of a dangerous, compulsive mind were firmly in place. Every solitary hour spent in the woods, every careful study of the natural and unnatural, and every act of secret experimentation drew him deeper into a private world where the ordinary rules of life and death no longer applied, a world that would eventually define the man he would become. The death of Ed Gein's mother marked a turning point in a life that had long been dominated by fear, control, and obsessive curiosity. With her gone, the oppressive voice that had dictated every thought, every action, and every desire was silenced, leaving Ed both liberated and unmoored. He inherited the family farm, a place that had been a site of both protection and torment, and suddenly he was free to explore the impulses that had been nurtured and constrained under his mother's watchful eyes. The quiet freedom was intoxicating, but it also revealed the depth of the darkness that had taken root over years of isolation and fear. Alone in the empty house, Ed began to push the boundaries of what he had previously only imagined. The farm became a laboratory for his obsessions, a place where the line between life and death blurred, and the ordinary world no longer applied. Nights were spent wandering graveyards, examining the hidden corners of the farm, and collecting items that no one else would dare touch. Bones, animal remains, and other fragments of the natural world were transformed into objects of fascination. Each act of collection, each careful study of decay, became a ritual that reinforced the strange sense of control he had cultivated since childhood. His reclusive behavior intensified. He avoided the townspeople and limited interactions to the bare minimum required for survival. Outsiders saw a quiet, almost timid man, tending to the farm with diligence and appearing harmless. Yet beneath this calm exterior, Ed's mind was consumed by a meticulous obsession. Every corner of the house, every barn, every storage space held evidence of a mind preoccupied with death, preservation, and ritual. The ordinary sounds of the town, the laughter of children, and the mundane routines of neighbors seemed distant and irrelevant to him, almost intrusions into a world that he alone could navigate. Strange occurrences began to ripple outward, unnoticed at first, but slowly attracting attention. Missing pets, odd smells, and glimpses of unusual items being moved about the property set the stage for whispers and unease among neighbors. Still, Ed maintained a careful control over what anyone could see. His routines were deliberate, his movements calculated, and his obsession hidden behind the mask of a solitary farmer. Each step he took further entrenched him in a private, secret world, a world where the rituals he had begun as a boy could expand unchecked. The psychological transformation was subtle but relentless. Freed from the moral constraints imposed by his mother, Ed explored the full extent of his fascination with life, death, and the remnants left behind. Objects collected from graves, once merely curiosities, became sacred tools in rituals that he performed alone. He experimented with preservation and reconstruction, creating a private universe where he could exercise absolute control over the fragile line between existence and decay. By the time the town began to feel the ripple effects of his presence, Ed had already descended into a complex web of obsession, secrecy, and ritualistic behavior, setting the stage for the shocking revelations that would eventually emerge. The farm, once a place of labor and maternal oversight, had become the epicenter of a man's private world, a domain where obsession replaced morality, isolation nurtured compulsions, and the natural order was reshaped according to a mind trained in secrecy and fear. Each night, each careful act of collection and study drew Ed further into the darkness, preparing him for a life defined not by ordinary humanity, but by the intricate, terrifying rituals of a mind that had long been captivated by death. As Ed Gein settled into life alone on the family farm, his obsessions evolved with a terrifying intensity. Freed from the strict control of his mother, he no longer felt the weight of imposed morality, and the behaviors he had long suppressed began to flourish unchecked. The farm, once a place of labor and mundane routines, transformed into a private domain where Ed could indulge his fascination with death, decay, and preservation. Objects collected from the woods, graveyards, and abandoned sites were no longer mere curiosities. They became components of a ritualistic world that existed solely for him. Animal hides were stretched and tanned, bones were cleaned and sorted, and every item served as a piece in a larger private puzzle that gave his life purpose and meaning. Ed's daily existence became a careful balance between the visible and the hidden. During daylight hours, he maintained the appearance of a quiet, hard-working farmer. Neighbors saw a man tending his land, performing chores, and avoiding unnecessary social contact. He spoke little, smiled less, and kept to himself, reinforcing the notion of harmlessness. Yet the hidden spaces of his home and barn told a vastly different story. Beneath the surface, Ed's world was governed by obsession and ritual. Shelves held carefully labeled items, drawers contained meticulously arranged specimens, and every act was governed by a compulsive attention to detail. The more elaborate his collections became, the more he withdrew from the ordinary life around him, preferring the company of objects and symbols to people. The psychological transformation was gradual but profound. The young boy who had once wandered the woods studying animals had become a man consumed by the thrill of control over life and death. Each act of collection, each new item preserved or studied, strengthened his sense of mastery over a world that had long felt threatening and incomprehensible. He developed a keen awareness of his own solitude, finding comfort in rituals that no one else could witness or understand. Over time, The boundaries between the ordinary and the macabre blurred completely, and the farm itself became an extension of his mind, a place where normal rules no longer applied. The presence of neighbors and the wider town grew increasingly irrelevant. Rumors and whispers of odd smells, missing pets, and strange movements around the property circulated quietly, but Ed remained untouchable. His secrecy was as precise as it was obsessive. Every object had its place, every routine had a purpose, and the careful maintenance of his hidden world became both a necessity and an obsession. He experimented with arrangements, modifications, and preservation techniques, each iteration deepening his involvement in the private rituals that defined his existence. By this stage, Ed's home was no longer merely a residence. It was a sanctuary for his compulsions, a shrine to obsession and ritual. His behaviors had escalated from fascination with death to a complex, immersive engagement with it. The quiet man, who appeared harmless in the eyes of the town, was, in reality, consumed by a meticulously constructed private universe, where decay and preservation, life and death, were subjects of constant study and manipulation. This evolution marked the final stage of a long, hidden transformation, setting the foundation for the shocking and macabre discoveries that would eventually bring his name to infamy. By the time the small Wisconsin town began sensing that something was not quite right at the Gein farm, Ed had already become fully absorbed in a world of ritual, obsession, and meticulously hidden compulsions. His life had narrowed to the rhythms of his private domain, a place where objects, bones, and skins were not merely possessions, but symbols of control, mastery, and fascination. Every corner of the house and barn reflected his increasingly elaborate engagement with death, and each day reinforced his separation from the ordinary lives of those around him. To outsiders, Ed remained the quiet, unassuming man who tended to his land and avoided unnecessary interactions. But the man they saw in daylight bore no resemblance to the reality that existed behind locked doors. The farm had become a stage for meticulous practices that combined obsession with ritual. Animal remains, carefully prepared and preserved, became tools in experiments that explored the fragility of life and the permanence of death. The objects he collected from graveyards were transformed through processes only he understood, and every act, no matter how small, was performed with precision and intent. This private universe was one of absolute control, where Ed could explore desires and curiosities long suppressed by his mother's strict moral oversight. The rituals became more elaborate, the spaces more compartmentalized, and the secrecy surrounding them more absolute. Neighbors noticed increasingly unsettling signs. Pets disappeared, items were moved in inexplicable ways, and a strange odor sometimes drifted from the farm. People spoke in hushed tones, their unease growing with every unexplained event. Yet no one could have imagined the scale or nature of what lay hidden. Ed's outward appearance, quiet, polite, and seemingly harmless, masked the intensity of the compulsions that had consumed him. He had perfected the art of concealment, ensuring that his private world remained untouched and undiscovered. Psychologically, Ed had become entirely absorbed in his obsessions. Years of isolation, fear, and rigid moral indoctrination had created a mind capable of extreme secrecy, meticulous planning, and detached fascination with death. The boundaries between right and wrong, normal and abnormal, had eroded, replaced by a personal logic rooted in control, curiosity, and ritualistic behavior. He existed entirely in his own constructed reality, one that prioritized preservation, collection, and symbolic manipulation over any conventional human connection. The ordinary world, with its rules, social expectations, and casual rhythms, seemed distant, irrelevant, and at times threatening to the fragile equilibrium of his private universe. By this point, the stage was set for the shocking revelations that would eventually horrify the nation. The foundations of his later crimes were firmly in place, built from a lifetime of maternal dominance, social isolation, and obsessive fascination with death and decay. Every item preserved, every ritual performed, every secret carefully maintained was a step in the evolution of a mind fully consumed by compulsion. Ed Gein had become a man whose existence was defined not by ordinary morality, but by the careful construction of a world governed by obsession, secrecy, and the relentless pursuit of mastery over life and death. The calm, quiet exterior presented to the world was the final concealment of a life shaped in the shadows, a life that would leave a lasting mark on history and the imagination of a horrified public.